I'm storyteller and author Pleasant DeSpain, and you have a wonderful imagination. Welcome to Pleasant Journeys. My story for today is called Old Joe and the Carpenter, and it's found in my collection called 33 Multicultural Tales to Tell. You would have liked Old Joe. He was a good man. He worked hard out there on the farm. He always had some dirt under his fingernails. He was living alone at this point in his life. His dear wife of so many years had passed, and their children, well, they were all grown and living in other parts of the country with their own families to raise. But Joe was not alone on the land. He had a good neighbor on the adjoining farm. And those two old guys, well, they knew each other so well. They would celebrate together a bit when times were good, and they'd help each other out if times were hard. But there was that one day. There must have been a couple of extra dark clouds in the sky that morning. Joe and his neighbor got into a terrible argument over a stray calf that neither one needed. Oh, it was found on his neighbor's land, and Joe said, look at the markings on that critter. Why, they're the same as one of my cows. I believe that's mine. And his neighbor was being stubborn and said, Joe, found on my land, my calf. And neither would give in. And they started arguing and shouting at each other, and they raised their fists. But just before they came to blows, those two old men, their faces red, turned around and stomped off to their respective doors and slammed them shut. And that was that. 2 weeks went by without a word between them. As you can imagine, Joe was feeling poorly. It was a Saturday morning, and there came a knock to his front door. Well, he knew it wasn't his neighbor. He always went to the back. When he opened the door, he was surprised. There was a stranger, a young man, standing there. He had a wooden box of carpenter's tools there at his feet, and he had a nice countenance about him. He said, hello, sir. I'm very good with my hands. I've got my tools. If you have a project or two, I could help. And Joe said, all right, I do have a project for you. I want you to look over yonder. See that red barn? That is my neighbor's barn. Dad burned him. You see that creek running all along our property lines there? That creek was just dug last week. My neighbor did it. He dug from the upper pond right on down our property lines and created that creek to separate us. I am so mad at him. I've got boards. I've got sawhorses. I've got everything you need to build me a fence. I want a big, nice, tall fence all along my property line. I don't want to see his place no more, and that'll teach him Dad burned him anyhow. The young man said, all right, Joe, I'll do a good job for you. Now, Joe had to go to town that day. He hitched up his wagon, and he was going for supplies. He said, I'll be back about sunset. I expect a good day's work done. The young man said he'd do his best. Joe took off, and that young man, he went right to work. He hauled all the boards, the sawhorses, the posts, everything he needed down to Creekside, and he went right to work. He measured, he sawed, he nailed, he did not stop for a single break. And then when the sun began to set, Joe returned, his wagon filled with supplies, and as he pulled into the yard, he couldn't believe what he was seeing. There was no fence, none at all. It was a bridge, a beautiful footbridge with handrails and all, and his neighbor was walking right across, his arms stuck out, saying, "Joe, oh Joe, I'm glad you did this. I don't want that calf." And Joe was saying, I don't want the calf neither. I want us to go on being the friends we are." His neighbor said, "What a good idea. I'm glad you did this." Joe said, "It wasn't my idea. It was his." And they turned to look. Carpenter had already put his tools away and hoisted that box up onto his shoulder. And he was starting to leave. And Joe said, "Oh, no, you have to stay. My neighbor and I, we know everybody in this valley. We're going to keep you busy for weeks." The young man just smiled, said, "Joe, I'd like to stay. I can't. I have more bridges to build." I found the bare bones of that story about 50 years ago. A school librarian in Bellingham, Washington, at one of my earlier school visits, told me that there was this story her father used to tell her, and it was about the carpenter who built a bridge instead of a wall. I looked and researched, and I finally found the bare bones of the story, but it didn't have the ending that it does now. So I started working on putting the story together because I wanted it to be one that I would tell. In fact, it has become my signature story over all of these years, with so many printings and so many tellings, not only by me, but by so many other wonderful storytellers and teachers and parents. Now, I was invited to a school on Queen Anne Hill back in the 70s, and I spent a half day there. And they gave me lunch and I think about $25. And one of the children, a girl from the school, went home to her big family and said, "Oh, we have to invite the storyteller to dinner." And I received the invitation, and when I showed up that evening, it was in front of a big old mansion on Queen Anne Hill. I went inside and started meeting all the inhabitants. It was a communal situation with kids and young adults and middle-aged and older people, and they were all functioning together as a family. Oh, it was a great meal. And lots of stories were shared at the table. And then at the end, they asked me to share a story. And I thought, well, I'll try out old Joe. We'll see what happens. And I began to tell the story. And as I told it, the listening was so intense, so generous, that the story just flowed right along. And I got to the end, and the words were there. "I'd like to stay, Joe. I can't. I have more bridges to build." That was the gift of listening that these good people gave to the story, gave to me, gave to all of us. And I have always felt blessed as a result. Thank you for listening. And please do me a great favor and give it a like. If you would so subscribe, I would be so grateful. It will help this channel grow. It's a very young channel, and we need to grow. And if you leave a comment, know that I will not only read it, but I'll respond if I can as well. Listed below is my website, and all of my books are there with a direct link to Amazon.com. There are so many stories yet to be told. Another story to tell next week.